Air pollution is a major public health threat. Over 90% of the world's population lives in areas that exceed World Health Organization air quality limits, and that contributes to almost 10 million deaths annually. Pollution can be hyperlocal. It can be highly variable depending on your neighborhood or even your street. Pollution can also be invisible, making it difficult to monitor visually. Yet we live in a time when sensors have become commonplace in our phones, on our wrists, telling us everything from our heart rate to today's weather. What if we could harness low-cost, ubiquitous sensors to tell us other things about our environment, to make the invisible visible? Could we empower ordinary people to monitor and report real-time data about their local air quality? Could we make it easier for communities and their leaders to understand the impact of local policies and to improve them as needed? Microsoft's Urban Innovation Initiative has been researching these types of questions for several years in partnership with academic and civic leaders. And it's my pleasure to introduce Madeleine Daepp, who is a senior researcher with Microsoft's Urban Innovation Initiative. The initiative has been researching these questions for several years in partnership with academic and civic leaders. Madeleine is particularly interested in finding ways to ensure that big data and new technologies serve the needs of cities and communities. Through the initiative's Project Eclipse, Madeleine led the design and analysis of a citywide air quality sensing network for Chicago. In this session, Madeleine will moderate a panel of academic and civic leaders discussing their experiences with hyperlocal air monitoring, including technical, social, and policy lessons they've learned, and what further innovations are needed to fully realize their vision.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're here today to talk about a major but often invisible public health threat, air pollution, and how deploying dense networks of IoT sensors can help make it visible. These networks are the first of what many researchers think will be a suite of technologies for climate-smart cities, where residents have real-time and hyperlocal information on how climate change is affecting them, and how efforts to reduce the pollutants that harm the planet can also help reduce the pollutants that harm people. It's an exciting time to care about air quality, but with big innovations and pressing societal needs comes a need for good, solid science and thoughtful policy making. And so in our session today, we wanted to talk with some of the leading researchers and regulators trying to take these innovations and figure out how to make them actionable. With us today are Naomi Zimmerman, an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in Sustainability. Naomi was a key architect of the Real-Time Affordable Multi-Pollutant Network, a network that has been operating for over 6 years in Pittsburg, Pennsylvania, and she's now leading multi-sectoral efforts to build low-cost sensing networks across Vancouver. Michael Ogletree is the director of the Air Pollution Control Division at the state of Colorado and the lead architect of Denver's award-winning Love My Air program, which created a citywide air quality monitoring network to track real-time pollution at the Denver public schools. Scott Counts is a principal research manager here at Microsoft Research who's been leading Project Eclipse, which included the design and deployment of over 100 sensors across Chicago, Illinois. And Dan Westervelt is the Lamont Assistant Research Professor at Columbia University and the Principal Investigator for the Clean Air Monitoring Solutions Network, the CAMSNet, a network of nearly 40 sensor networks across North America, Europe, Africa, India, and China. To frame the discussion, I'd like to have each of you speak for just a couple of minutes about your organization, your role, and how you came to be interested in deploying low-cost air quality networks. Naomi, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got from RAMP to where you are now?
Yeah, so I was extremely fortunate. I was a postdoctoral researcher starting in 2015 at Carnegie Mellon University's Center for Atmospheric Particle Studies. And I just happened to, wander into the office of a colleague that I was working with who was tinkering with a device on their desk. And it was something that had been built by a couple Carnegie Mellon alumni who had some electrical engineering background, who were thinking about, ways of putting some of these new-ish low-cost sensor modules into a box and seeing what we could do with them. And I became very interested in these devices and mainly on seeing if we could get data out of them that was more accurate and more reliable. And so I just honestly, as a side project, started working on looking at algorithms for calibrating these sensors, and ended up getting a lot of traction with them, and became so interested in deploying things in real world contexts. So it was just something that happened sort of fortuitously and sort of hooked me ever since.
Classic story of innovation, stumbling into somebody's office and finding something to tinker with on the desk. Mike, Michael, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with Love My Air?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the Love My Air network, we were fortunate enough at the City and County of Denver to win an innovation grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies, which allowed us the opportunity to kind of co-develop what a air monitoring network would look like in Denver. So we worked closely with Denver Public Schools as well as stakeholders in the area, including parents, teachers, and nurses, and through iterative focus groups came up with a way to really engage with our communities and our school communities using low-cost sensors to inform different strategies they could employ locally, and really kind of spark additional interest around air quality and those improvements around schools.
That's so interesting. I've got a lot of questions for you later in this panel about stakeholder engagement and how to get people excited about air quality data. Scott, can you tell us a little bit about Eclipse and urban innovation?
Yeah, so the urban innovation team at Microsoft Research, I think, sustainability and public health are really just key pillars of the team's mission, the team's research agenda. And so we want to be able to just kind of measure factors that are relevant to those, and measure in novel ways, measure very localized geographic scales. And so I think that, especially for air pollution, but maybe other domains as well, low cost sensing is just a really foundational technology to push on and to push that technology development just to support the urban science that we want to do as a team.
And Dan, tell us a little bit more about the CAMSnet and how you came to be interested in deploying low cost air quality sensors.
Yeah, so the CAMSnet is a international network of networks that's aimed around getting useful, actionable data out of low-cost sensors, and also accelerating novel use cases for low-cost air sensors. So there's a lot of people around the world in this country and beyond that are using air sensors, but there's always the question of how good is the data and how can we trust it. And so our network is really focused on and helping those questions and answering those questions and supporting the adoption of low-cost sensors around the globe. And for how I got to be involved in this was a little bit similar to Naomi's story. It was a little bit serendipitous in that I was a volunteer Department of State Air Quality Fellow, and I was assigned to a post in Africa, in Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there were simply no ways to measure air quality in this place that was very resource limited besides some low-cost sensors. And so that's how I got into this field.
Let me follow up on that. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the promise and potential. I think, folks who don't spend every day on the ground doing air quality sensing maybe don't know that, in the United States here, the regulatory system is pretty sparse. It's immensely effective. Most cities have a few monitors, but in terms of the city of Chicago, that's a 600 square kilometer city that has a handful of regulatory monitors. And so if you're trying to look at neighborhood level differences, you can't say much. And as you said, Dan, you have countries around the world and even, small cities here like Kenmore, Washington, that don't have any regulatory monitors. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about kind of the unique challenges of building a network in a city that's never previously collected air quality data, and some of the ways that your team is working to produce actionable data and actionable research.
So the biggest challenge there is, it's hard to have a baseline for what the gold standard or sort of the ground truth for the air quality concentrations should be. So the low-cost sensors themselves can report the data, but if you want to be very, very sure about the quality of the data, it's really best to first test the performance of that sensor against something that you trust and that is sort of a tried and true method. So the way that we've been getting around that is by simply trying to acquire reference monitors or high quality instruments through a lot of different means. We've gotten some through donations. We've just purchased some through different grants, and basically use that as sort of a baseline to correct a high number of low-cost sensors that then can be spread out through the city, and this correction factor can be applied. So that's been our strategy so far, and I know that there's people that, including our group, that are working on ways that don't necessarily involve purchasing this local reference monitor and still being able to get high quality data out of low-cost sensors. So that's very much an emerging research area in this field.
Cool. Naomi, the RAMP network was one of the early initiatives in this space, and I think you were one of the first people to kind of show how if you do have a regulatory monitor, you can really get to a place where you feel confident in some of these low-cost sensors and the ways that they're used. Can you talk a little bit about just, what it felt like, what challenges you encountered? Did you think that you were going to be able to use this data for your research, or did you think, oh gosh, it's going to be a long, long journey from, little lines, rows and rows of data to something that's actually tells us information and ultimately, knowledge about our air quality?
I tend to be, a very optimistic person, so I was very determined, and so I felt pretty confident. But trying to convince people that I was working with definitely was a long road. I mean, we sort of published the sort of first paper about this. I think it officially came out in like late 2017, early 2018, and I had truly been working on it since like early 2016. So you can imagine all the meetings that I had to go through to sort of show about some of the sort of stuff we were doing to try to process the data. So I was always optimistic, but I think, the community of calibration of low-cost sensors has really exploded in the last few years, and I'm so excited by, all the stuff that's been going on in this space. Interestingly, some of the biggest challenges, I think, from early deployments were, we were simultaneously working on the calibration, but even things like form factor of the sensors. We had these sort of like oversized boxes, power connectivity, getting people even to be aware in the community of what a low-cost sensor was and agreeing to, have a sensor up on a rooftop or on a balcony. All of these things were sort of new, and I think that managing all of those different logistical aspects was almost as challenging as the calibration algorithms, because it wasn't something that people were as familiar with. I think that is changing. I've seen things like purple air sensors ending up on like Washington Post gift guides. So I think there's an awareness of low-cost sensors now that there wasn't before. So more, uptake by the community. But yeah, the challenges are multifaceted in this space, as I'm sure all of you who have deployed sensors are highly aware of.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to speak a little bit to that from kind of the policy perspective, or, working with schools and cities and a multifaceted stakeholder group, how you, what you saw as the big challenges and how you overcame them?
Yeah, absolutely. At the city, as I mentioned before, kind of working collaboratively and really co-developing, how we use the data from these low-cost sensors. Certainly, some of the challenges that both Dan and Naomi, laid out with calibrations, it's something that was one of the first challenges. I think tackling that in collaboration with how do you use that data and how do you inform communities on the use of the data and how they can use it to make decisions around their exposure. I think that was, certainly some of the challenges. It was also, in my case, challenging to get schools to adopt them. Because people are hesitant to put sensors on and measure air quality at schools, in particular because of the potential impact for things like registration. If you see that, oh, my school has worse air quality than another school, in Denver, they could choice out and go to a different school. So there was some hesitation. So kind of really explaining to them how they could use that to improve how they manage their air quality and use it as more of a proactive measure. Now in my current role at the Air Division, bringing over some of those same strategies and methodologies for community engagement. And we recently actually passed regulation using some low-cost sensors for monitoring around oil and gas sites. So that came with its own challenges and how that was rolled out. Some of that has to do with data communication protocols and how that data is shared. But we're looking at some of that data and starting to be able to use that to better inform how we address some of the exposure around some of these oil and gas facilities in Colorado.
I want to follow up on that. Under kind of a broad umbrella, you could think about all of these projects as smart city initiatives, right? Sometimes people, I think you actually count under Denver's smart city plan. And one of the big early critiques of smart cities is that they can be very technocratic, right? Technologists and researchers sort of deploy sensors, get really excited about them, but don't necessarily have a participatory process, don't have a clear plan for engaging stakeholders. And what just blows me away about the air quality community is that every one of you has made stakeholder collaboration, stakeholder engagement and collaboration across sectors a top priority, which I'm so curious about. What is it about the air sensors community that's so different, and how are we doing this? So Michael, I wanted to just kind of come back to, you've mentioned bringing in communities, bringing in these stakeholders, building these relationships multiple times. Why is that such a priority, and how do you go about actually doing that?
Why it's a priority, I'll start with that, is that collecting data and high resolution data, regardless of the quality, needs to start with why are we doing this, right? And I think for all of the air quality community, including the low cost sensor community, making sure that we're collecting data to better improve and inform exposure at the lives of communities. So that's the why behind, I think, why we all do our work. In terms of how to engage, for me it's kind of being boots on the ground, like personally going out there and hearing and listening to those communities and making sure that the data we're collecting can really be used to inform how they can protect themselves, and we as policymakers, how we can use that to improve policy.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's I think we've certainly found in Chicago that our research questions and our priorities in terms of our analyses completely change when you spend a few days in the community and you meet with people and you hear what the reasons they have for caring about air quality data are, and you find maybe it's not telling people where to go for a jog to avoid air pollution. Maybe it's actually telling them where what times of day to think about anti-idling campaigns and bigger policy issues. Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Do you want to talk about how we approach this with respect to Eclipse and our work?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just kind of, building on what Michael was just saying, what you were just saying. I mean, I think especially from the perspective of a big technology company like Microsoft, you really just can't sort of parachute in and drop a bunch of technology on a community. I mean, the community needs to trust that, their voices are being heard and respected and taken into account into this, kind of collaboration, really. And even just from a scientific perspective, like you were just saying, Madeleine, I mean, the community members are the experts. They live there, and so you want to hear what they're telling you about their neighborhood. And so I think when you sort of put all that together, I think this kind of concept, at least one thing that really emerged from the Eclipse deployment in Chicago, was this concept of community-driven innovation. I think is just a really valuable concept to think about from the perspective of technology development that's kind of by and for communities.
Yeah, Mary Gray in the New York MSR office has been really driving this research agenda around community-driven innovation that I think is just such an exciting area. Naomi, I know with RAMP you baked in community engagement, and now you've expanded with collaborations in Vancouver with bringing in government, community, and industry stakeholders. And you're in the mechanical engineering department, which I don't know if folks often are bringing in all those different stakeholders. So can you talk a little bit about making multi-sectoral collaboration a priority in your work, and what advice you might have for engineers and technologists seeking to take a similar approach?
Yeah, I think, for me, I've always been sort of like a engineer on the fringe, in that, like, I've always been interested in some interdisciplinary aspects of engineering and sort of a more holistic look of engineering. And I'm also really excited to think that the view of engineering is shifting a little bit in the way we think about, the role that engineers can play in some of these societal challenges. For me, when I started my position in Vancouver, it was really important that every single grant that I wrote, every project that I chose to be involved in, had someone from the get-go who could help disseminate the information out and engage and talk about, what the priorities are. So those are people who are formally part of grant teams. I don't think I have a single grant where an end user or stakeholder is not part of the official grant team. And that was just a decision that I made. And I think that it's made like all of the projects so much better for it. And I think the reason for me was that, I really do want the work to be impactful. And I think also for me, when I moved to Vancouver, I didn't know very many people. And it was also really an important way for me to connect with my own new city and new community, was to sort of just have coffee with people and talk about, what their interests are, and, what their problems are, and, doing things like speaking at events at libraries and things like that. So it was sort of as much personal for me as it was a research thing, and I really think it's made the research a lot stronger. And I would encourage anyone in engineering who has a tangential interest in this sort of thing to to try to make those connections. And it's okay to not be an expert in some of those sort of social science aspects or community engagement aspects, because you don't have to be. There are amazing people out there who would love to work with you, and just finding the right people to engage in building those communities has been super empowering. And I think that it's something that almost anybody could do in any discipline of engineering, and it would really strengthen their work.
Yeah, that's a great point. Dan, I want to turn it over to you as well. Something I really admire about the CAMSnet is your commitment to capacity building. When we were at the Air Sensors International Conference, it was clear that you and your team had worked really hard to make sure that partners from regulatory agencies around the world could, be in Pasadena and could attend and meet kind of the leaders in the air quality space. And my sense is that you're always seeking ways to collaborate that build skills and create new opportunities for everybody that you work with. Can you talk a little bit about effective capacity building, especially, for other folks who might be looking maybe to prototype but ultimately hand over networks to local leaders?
Yeah, so we like to, incorporate capacity building into our science efforts in pretty much every setting, because otherwise it becomes sort of a colonial type of approach where you're just going into a country, whether it's in Africa or India or somewhere, and taking data and not giving back at all to the community. And so we kind of reject that idea, and we really spend a lot of time on training folks, simultaneously as we're collecting new data. It's also doubling as a training opportunity for them to work hands-on with the data and eventually take ownership of the data, hand things over. And in terms of making capacity building successful and sustainable, there's a few pieces of advice that I would have. I think one is you really have to keep at it. So if you have a week-long training course on some topic related to air quality, and it's very intensive and it's great, you have to sort of keep people engaged, because otherwise what can happen is they attend that week-long course and then they never think about it again, and it's sort of just lost. So keeping on, with weekly, or not weekly, but maybe monthly checkups, or every now and then, continuing the discussion is really important. And then the other thing that I would say is that in order to make things like this sustainable and long-lasting, it's important to sort of embed these training curricula or these training programs into existing frameworks. An example of this might be embedding a training course or a certificate course into a local university's curriculum, making it like a formal class. And if it's not sort of a university setting, you could make the same argument for maybe a standard new employee onboarding or training package for like a regulatory agency in lower and middle income countries.
Yeah, Naomi and Michael, do you see a role for similar approaches here in the United States and Canada?
I can go first. I'll say, absolutely. I mean, I think even things as simple as like when you're processing air quality data, like, are you using open source packages sometimes to do that? Are you, taking efforts to sort of share some of that information out there? So, we've been trying to do things as well, like, publish open source repositories of coding approaches and articles online. We're working on sort of some white papers for different projects that we've been working on. So I think, the the difference, at least in the Vancouver area, is that some of the monitoring capacity and some of the outreach is handled sort of at the regulatory level. We have a really fabulous regulatory agency at Metro Vancouver, but just trying to build out any resources we can as we go along has been really, really helpful in terms of even things like coding, what metrics to look at, what do they mean, what does it mean to look at air quality sensor data, and supporting that community that way.
Yeah, and I would just say it's been interesting to see kind of the evolution of this over the past couple of years, and certainly in my role as it transitioned. So at the city, what I was trying to do was build in a smaller version what Dan's building now, which is like a local like network of networks. So we at the city had our own network, and Boulder County had their network, and Broomfield had their network. How do we do better collaborating and bringing all of that information and knowledge together to be able to really make the most use of these previously disparate sensor networks? As I transition here at the state, what I'm trying to do now is build on that, right? There's only so much we could do as an individual city in trying to lead a statewide collaboration. So now at the state, we could certainly, work with locals and, community groups across the state to network the entire state. So we all have, better data, better access to that information, and can use that to better inform policy. It's something I'm really interested in and looking forward to, certainly focus on in the next few years.
I wanted to talk a little bit, obviously, about the relevance to climate change, right? The title of this, we've talked about the low-cost sensors, calibration, bringing in communities, but the title of this panel is Climate Smart Cities. And I'm curious to hear from each of you about how you're thinking about this work in light of climate change as sort of one of the great challenges of our time. And Scott, maybe I'll start with you. I think when we started working on air quality, it was in part because there were wildfires in Washington, and folks even at the Microsoft Redmond campus were affected by the smoke. And I've since read that, according to the Duke climate scientist Drew Shindell, that the public health costs of air pollution are so high that the total decarbonization of the American energy sector would pay for itself just through the public health benefits alone. Sometimes you read these stats just about air pollution and you're absolutely blown away. So can you talk a little bit about what it means to give cities and their residents the ability to monitor the health benefits of decarbonization as it's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I saw that kind of statistic as well about the kind of connection between, sort of the public health benefits of air quality, or measuring air quality and climate. Seems like a clear win-win for sure. I think with this kind of localized air quality, at least, that, we're trying to do with Eclipse, it's a way to sort of make some of this information, I think, very relevant to people in almost a day-to-day sense, and very timely. Sometimes with climate, I guess, unfortunately, we are feeling the very direct effects more and more frequently. But in some sense, it kind of happens a little bit under our noses. And so I think, there's an opportunity to really connect with people in just a very almost personal way, especially when you have very localized measurement. You can make neighborhood level, metrics and things available, maybe even personal, kind of histories or something of exposures at some point potentially. And so there's just this, potential to really kind of raise awareness and make something very relevant to people. So some of the things that we're trying to do with Eclipse to connect with people are, actually go into the physical environment. So for instance, in the city of Chicago, where we have our Eclipse sensors on bus shelters, there are barcodes on the physical shelters themselves that you can scan to get local air quality measurements. We have something called an EcoPod, which is kind of like a little mobile pop-up eco lab almost, where we've kind of gone into communities and done events around it to sort of raise awareness. Of course, we're also trying to push on making data available for researchers, but just for anybody as well from the Eclipse network, and then thinking about other kind of more kind of novel ways to sort of visualize and bring data to people. So I think there's just a wide open space there for thinking about how do we make these data that are coming from these low cost sensors as kind of resonant with people in almost a day-to-day sense as we can.
Dan, maybe if you could go next, what role do you see for low-cost networks in contributing to action on climate adaptation or mitigation efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think many people are realizing now that climate change and air quality are kind of very related issues. And so there's a lot of overlap here in terms of work that can be done in characterizing amounts of air pollutants in the air. That can be motivated by a health concern approach or also a climate concern approach. So I think, low cost sensors for air, can sort of be a motivating factor for both issues, not just air quality, but also for climate change. They can also be directly relevant to climate change in the way that certain pollutants are also climate forcing agents. So, I mean, just purely from a data collection perspective, if you have data on, a certain pollutant, there's a chance it's probably also impacting the climate. So you could use it to make conclusions on that. And I also think that, people are really motivated in all around the world about climate change. And so the two issues can sort of feed off each other and be useful in terms of drawing attention to one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much intersectionality between climate change, air quality, and even something like odor. Like I think about the heat dome that happened last year in the Pacific Northwest, and we had simultaneous record-breaking heat. We tracked an explosion in odor-related complaints that we have a little citizen science app that's not, it's sort of not a low-cost sensor, but it's, Smell Vancouver, and we saw huge spikes in odor complaints. And we had ozone advisories, right? So all of these things are related, the frequency and intensity of these heat-related events and all these things that can happen sort of simultaneously because of this. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to sort of, comment on or provide data on some of those intersections with air quality and climate. Certainly in Vancouver, we've looked at things like wildfire smoke because there is going to be, increasing number and intensity of wildfires in the region that are primarily driven by climate change, and things like low-cost sensors can be really helpful for looking at building adaptations. So can you do surveying while you do indoor-outdoor data and look at mechanical design or different building characteristics to help with that sort of adaptation piece? That's really important. And also one other sector we've been looking at really closely that is so driven by climate change policy in British Columbia is different strategies, especially in the transportation space around decarbonization. So if cities are going to have policies around electric vehicles or where they're going to put charging stations, can we quantify actual benefits in that in terms of air quality in the heavy duty space for trucks, ships, boats, those sorts of things. We have a low carbon fuel standard that is primarily, a climate change policy in British Columbia, which we would expect to also have some air quality effects, potentially co-benefits as well. So things like, can we instrument corridors along near ports with low cost sensors and sort of quantify those co-benefits? And I really think that awareness of those co-benefits or that intersectionality in the air quality community will hopefully really strengthen some of this climate policy. So I think, there's no shortage of overlaps in this space.
So Michael, I'll turn it to you. What role do you see for low-cost networks in action on climate adaptation and mitigation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two key pieces that we're working here in Colorado. One of them's around better forecasting. So with a denser network across the state, we can better put out, different forecasts for potential impacts to air quality in different regions, right? So improving forecasting is one that we currently use, some of these low-cost sensors in. The other one is, as I mentioned, through regulation, how can we be quicker in addressing some of these, fugitive emissions or leaks from some of these sources. In the case of Colorado, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. How can we be quicker in addressing some of those? So Regulation 7 requires the use of monitoring around facilities, and many here in Colorado have adapted the use of PIDs and the low-cost sensors in that space to be able to do that. So now, through regulation, we're requiring that these different facilities have plans in place and real-time measurements of total VOCs to be able to make sure that they address those as quickly as possible. So without something like low-cost sensors and the ability to distribute them more widely, the types of regulations that we're requiring for some of our facilities just wouldn't be possible. So it's really great that there has been advancements in this space so we can be quicker at addressing some of these fugitive emissions from some of these sources across Colorado.
So it's about having a dense network, but Michael, it's also, the real-time information is really important, right? Can you talk just a little bit about like the difference between policy with real-time versus, data that you get 3 months later?
Yeah, I mean, by having the access to real-time data, it allows us to make those changes quickly, right? It's one thing to get a report even after a month and say like, hey, there's an issue here. But when you can pinpoint that and say like, hey, we've had elevated readings for the past 20 minutes, let's go out there and be sure that we address those, right? Because the longer we see those emissions, the more impact they're having on things like climate and also health of local residents. So having access to real-time data from these distributed low-cost sensor networks is super valuable in implementing policy that it's actionable in real time.
Yeah, that's just so exciting, and so contingent on these advances in communications technologies and IoT networks. So it's exciting to see how this is translating into actionable work. Naomi, maybe another question for you, which is, we all work on air quality. We think it's really important. We focus on air quality. But obviously, there's also, the forms of air pollution that don't affect humans, but really affect the planet, like carbon dioxide. There's, heat, you mentioned, vector-borne disease, viruses. Do you think that there are lessons from this research that can inform monitoring and tracking of those other things that might be exacerbated by climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I always hope that any sort of community-engaged monitoring can inform, other ways of doing this sort of monitoring. I was even thinking, as Michael was talking about, the need for real-time information, and I was thinking that, one thing we've implemented with the low-cost sensors that we've had out in Vancouver is we've been co-deploying through the Hello Lamppost platform so that you can have a text message based conversation with the low cost sensor, and it's sort of informal and conversational, and it does, ultimately, ideally it would just report the data to you directly, but it does sort of link to a dashboard at the end of that conversation. And one thing that we saw is that, when we were having either a day before or when we did have a smoke event, because normally an advisory will come out beforehand, we saw huge spikes in engagement with the conversations with the sensors that are sort of correlated with the AQI or air quality index. And to me, that really spoke to the power of having that real-time dissemination and thinking about those tools for how we get data out there and how they potentially could be used for other communities. So we're thinking about this platform at a number of community centers all across British Columbia, and using them, with air quality sensing data, which is, what is sort of my bread and butter, but also, taking advantage of them being there to, disseminate other public health information as needed. So that's an application that's sort of in partnership with a local health authority, and so they would want to use that platform, not just for air quality, but also for other things they might want to disseminate out, because some of the research has shown that messaging around some of these environmental issues, it is better when it's more customized to the community that you're actually trying to engage with. And I think sometimes there's a huge role of sort of broadcast alerts and warnings about things, but I think if you can customize the message to the people who are going to be sort of using that community center or in that community space, you might get more uptake. So even, for example, they saw that local radio was a very effective way of communicating different messaging around wildfire smoke prevention or exposure prevention. And so we're interested in seeing, can we leverage these tools that we've been using for air quality around, text message based conversations in these other ways as well. So, I'm not leading the other public health part, but I just think that, around that community engagement piece, there's lots of opportunity there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Certainly a lesson from all of these COVID trackers has been that, just putting data up is not the same as actually getting that information out there. So Dan, what about you? Do you have examples or ways in which you think the CAMSNet has or is catalyzing action and change?
Yeah, so one thing that we've had some success with is just getting data in the hands of the right people that need it. So the people that are affected by the poor air pollution, the poor air quality. really raises the awareness and really kind of empowers them to, for example, hold their government officials or their environmental ministries responsible or accountable for leading to some positive change. So it's been a bit indirect at this moment, I would say, but we're finding that the having this evidence that sort of backs what people are just experiencing anecdotally by just existing and breathing really helps them make the case and helps them really affect change locally, because it probably can't be the folks from the US telling governments in other countries like, hey, you need to clean up your act. Like that's probably not going to win them over. It's not going to go over well. So we're really trying to leave that and support the local population as much as possible in doing that.
Yeah, you end up really focusing on some of these environmental justice principles of making sure that the people closest to the problem are in the rooms and have the empowerment that they need to be able to actually work on these problems and lead the charge. So I'm curious, we're talking about actions, opportunities, all these things, but I did want to just talk a little bit about kind of the next big open research problems, especially for researchers, and the next big open challenges for policymakers. Naomi, anytime that you are building something new, every solved problem leads to a new challenge. And so I'm curious what you see as the next big open problems that you'd want people to work on.
Yeah, like for me, I'll speak about something that I know we have spoken about before that's sort of a big research interest of mine, and I think can hopefully be very, hopefully impactful. Is this sort of thinking about, I think there have been a number of very successful low-cost sensor network deployments, but I keep thinking about, what is a, a more perfect sensor deployment look like? And I've been thinking about questions about, how we choose where we deploy sensors and how we can think about that question and maybe in a little bit more of an intelligent way. So what I've been really thinking about, and I'm super excited about, is thinking about essentially how we make decisions about where we put sensors in a sort of pseudo optimized kind of way. So doing things like looking at strategic plans for cities where they're planning on making changes, where they're considering things like street calming or congestion pricing, and almost having those as inputs along with other like land use variables. So things like, traffic density, residential density, where we know local sources are. A lot of that informs where we put sensors now, but sometimes from my perspective, you want not just to have sensors, where you think there's going to be air pollution, but you also want to have sensors where you think there might be air pollution where you can actually do something about it. So sort of linking the sensor to the action from the get-go has been something I've been thinking about. So, how can we have sort of informed sensor location, sort of optimization algorithms? I don't know exactly what this will look like yet, but it's something that I think is really interesting to me. It's almost like you take a map of a city and you sort of have different layers that might be weighted in a sensor location sort of optimization thing. One is is there power? Is there Wi-Fi? What's the cellular network look like? That's sort of one element of connectivity. Is there a planned change in the city that's been discussed in terms of strategic plans of some of the initiatives I've mentioned? Is there layers around environmental justice or social and material deprivation that could go into these algorithms? And then things like commercial density, residential density, many of the covariates that go into some of the land use regression mapping, and trying to take all of this data and sort of figure out, are there some locations that hit on many of these things, or can we build more sort of intelligent stratified maps of where we should be doing sensors? And then also maybe looking critically back at where we have deployed sensors and see how well we've been doing on some of those metrics, so that we can hopefully, when we present a case or go to a community and say, hey, we'd really love to put a sensor here, we can talk about all the things that, went into that, and also help build those layers of importance, with the community from the beginning. It's supposed to be sort of prescribing the location, sort of working together to sort of build where we might want to put sensors. And I've just been thinking about that question a lot. If we're going to have millions of dollars around a deployment of 100 sensors or 1,000 sensors over a couple of years, what upfront planning can we put into this to make sure that it's connected to the action from the beginning? kind of thing. So that's what I'm really excited about. It's like a big thing that's been swirling around in my brain. Will it work? Is it feasible? I have no idea, but I would like to try.
Yeah, absolutely. We found that designing the network is one of the most valuable spots to surface local priorities and figure out what people care about, and also, bring in that research expertise with respect to research design. So maybe a low code, no code tool that lets people have access to all those surfaces would be just incredibly cool. I know that we're nearing the end of this discussion, so I wanted to ask everyone, just as Naomi did, just about your vision for the future, what the ideal network might look like, and what kind of insights you hope it might produce. So maybe Dan, and then Michael, and then Scott.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm excited about is trying to find the best way possible to leverage all of the existing low-cost sensor data that's out there. And I think you can go onto the Purple Air website and you can see that, just with Purple Air, how many, many thousands or whatever numbers of these things there are. There's never going to be enough regulatory monitors to go around and do like the tried and true co-location correction factor for every single place. And that's just in the US. I mean, if you start talking about Africa or elsewhere, there's going to be even less of a chance. So one thing that I'm really excited for, and I hope that the direction in the future goes, is that we start looking at ways to sort of get around that sort of traditional paradigm, which, to be completely honest, is great. That works. We have these local co-locations, but I think we can try to develop some statistical methods and come up with some clever ways to maybe get around that and really leverage the vast numbers of low-cost sensor data that are out there around the world in a fully, innovative way.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, we do have lots of low-cost sensors. But we also do have, a good amount of regulatory data, and now with satellites and different methods for measuring air quality, like how do we work to harmonize that data? I think South Coast calls it data fusion. How do we fuse all these different data sets to better inform how we fill in the gaps between those data points? I think certainly having as much, point source data from sensors or mid-tier instruments or regulatory instruments is valuable. But then, as we bring in additional data sets, how do we bring them all together to get the best overall data set so we can have a clear view of how they all interplay and how we can, best measure and use that air quality data.
This is amazing. These are all AI and ML challenges. And just for anybody who's listening, this is a reminder that Microsoft has an 18-month civic leave policy. So if you've been here 2 years, you can take 18 months and work for a government agency or do service. And Michael, I know that you're looking for folks with these skills and talents to lead some of this work. So just want to make sure that folks are aware of that. And Scott, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this, in some sense, kind of almost ultimate goal of having this, accurate, real-time, fully interpolated, kind of surface of kind of localized air quality data over a city. And, just to give you sort of coverage at every single point in a city. And certainly data fusion, I assume, will be just a huge part of that. Some things that we've started to work on at Microsoft as well. And then, like Naomi said, I mean, I think really love this idea of starting with the policy and working backwards. I mean, you can do effectively an infinite number of things with the data that you're collecting, but really having the most impact you can by, like Naomi was saying, incorporate that into your design of your deployment, incorporate that into the different, analysis that you're going to be doing with the data that you collected to sort of ultimately maximize the impact.
So I want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing to sort of take this invisible challenge, make it visible, and make it so that, parents who are worried about their child's breathing, people who are worried about the health of elderly folks and young people are able to really act and amplify some of these policies. So thank you so much to all of you, and I can't wait to see what work and policy and actions you produce next.
Thank you.
Thanks.